first Wednesday. What a lovely turnout tonight. My name is Sarah Rooker, and I'm the director of the Norwich Historical Society, and I want to welcome you.
And I'm Lucinda Walker. I'm the director of the Norwich Public Library, and as always, it's just amazing to look out into this wonderful full audience. You know, we've all come together in this beautiful space to hear about lives and share stories, which is such an important part of our lives. My first thing is to please turn off any mobile device you might be carrying. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council. It's co-hosted by the library and the Historical Society. First Wednesdays is supported statewide by the Alma Gives Dochin Foundation, National Life Group Foundation, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Vermont Department of Libraries. Tonight's talk is also specially underwritten by the Norwich Bookstore, and the bookstore is selling copies of Reeve's books this evening. The library and the Historical Society would also like to thank our generous underwriters, the Boatwright Foundation, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Mascoma Savings Bank, Norwich Square Properties, and Jane W. Stetson and E. William Stetson III. New this month, audience feedback forms are located at the table by the back door. You can also fill out the form and provide suggestions for upcoming talks online at the Vermont Humanities Council's website. If you decide to contact the Humanities Council by November 8th, your name will be entered into a raffle to win the 2017 Vermont Reads book by Jacqueline Woodson, Brown Girl Dreaming. So, to introduce Reeve, I will ask Penny McConnell to come up. Penny is former board member of the Vermont Humanities Council and a board member of the Norwich Public Library.
Golly, what a great audience. Fabulous. Thank you, so many people for coming out. It's a pleasure to once again be introducing Reeve at a book talk, as she has come to the Norwich Bookstore several times. I first encountered her mother, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, when I was in my early 30s and reading a lot of fiction. I had 3 young children, and lucky for me, I wasn't a working person at that time, and I read voraciously. And when I picked up her first diary, Bring Me a Unicorn, my life really changed, because I realized that these stories and women who were like me, but not fiction, were writing about things that really meant something to me. I read those books voraciously. I think when I read the first one, the second one was also out, and then I had to wait for the next books. And then when I discovered Reeve, it was this whole new part of being part of that family and feeling close to Anne and close to Reeve and all of those lives. So it's a real treat to have you here. Reeve grew up in Connecticut. After graduating from Radcliffe College in the late 60s, she moved to Vermont, where she still lives on an old farm near St. Johnsbury with her husband, writer Nat Tripp. She's the author of more than 24 books for children and adults, including Under a Wing, a memoir of growing up in the Lindbergh family, Forward from Here, Leaving Middle Age and Other Unexpected Adventures, and Homer the Library Cat. With other family members, she recently edited the final volume of her late mother's diaries and letters, Against Wind and Tide, which we are selling tonight, and from which she will speak to us tonight. Please welcome Reeve Lindbergh to Norwich.
I turned that one off. You turned that one off? Yeah. I think I turned this one on. I'm very glad to be here. I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. It's a kind of a cold November night to be coming out, and well, I'm just delighted. The book I'm going to be talking about, Against Wind and Tide, is the last of my mother's series of diaries and letters, and she, in fact, during her lifetime, was best known for this book, Gift from the Sea, which I still read every year and love. And she later, or excuse me, she much earlier wrote several books about her time of flying and exploration with my father. This one, North to the Orient, is probably my favorite. And John Fox just handed me a copy. He's a collector, and he handed me a copy that is inscribed for Will from Amelia. And he thinks he knows which Amelia it was. And John, I cannot believe you just handed that to me. It's an extraordinary thing to do. And this is my favorite of my mother's flying memoirs, or her flying adventure books. There's a wonderful spirit of both her own eloquence and her sense of incredible adventure during those years when she and my father flew together, exploring the first air routes all over the world for what later became Pan American Airways. And there they were. They were maybe 25 and 29, and they were going over the pole to Asia and down the coast of South America, through Africa, all over the world, just the two of them, exploring for future airline passage. My mother once, she wrote in this book about landing in I think it was an Inuit village when they were going over the pole, and she took an orange from her pocket and gave it to a woman with a baby. And she said the woman held it as if it were a jewel, because of course they didn't see oranges. Anything that came to where they were, anything fresh, was no longer fresh when it got to them. And all supplies had to come by boat, which took forever. And she had just landed like a bird and pulled out an orange and given it to this woman. So she wrote many lovely stories in this book, North to the Orient. And later she wrote a number of other books. She wrote Gift from the Sea. And toward the end of her life, she began editing her own diaries and letters. The one that Penny spoke of, Bring Me a Unicorn, which covers the years from when she was a schoolgirl at Miss Chapin's school, and when she went on to Smith College. And then in one Christmas in Mexico, my father came to see her family, having finished his flight across the Atlantic and his flight afterwards around this country, landing in various stops. I think it was 82 cities. One of them was Springfield, Vermont, which was at that time the only town in Vermont that had an airfield. So he would land where there were airports, and Springfield was one of them. They just had a 90th anniversary celebration of that event, and I was there, which was a great treat. But after she wrote Bring Me a Unicorn, at the very end of which she writes to a friend, "It appears I'm going to marry Charles Lindbergh." She was always very surprised. She wrote another book, Locked Rooms and Open Doors, about her time of her early marriage. There's a picture of her in her flying helmet, and this was the time when they during their flight together, and when they had their first child, Charles. And this one is called Hour of Gold, Hour of Lead, and as you can imagine, I think that's from an Emily Dickinson poem. I think so. And this, of course, is about the death of the first child, Charles, who died in a kidnapping tragedy when he was just about 2 years old. And after that time, her life changed. They went to Europe to live, and she began to write and to heal and to begin and to raise her next son, my brother John, who was born just after, a couple of months after the death of that first child. And he began the family that I knew. He was the oldest, I was the youngest of 5. We grew up together, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. So this was the story of after the lost baby, moving to Europe, writing, and having her 2 boys, John, and then my brother Land. And then this one is called War Within and Without, and it covers the years before the war, when my father gave very controversial speeches, spoke out against the war, was called a Nazi, and then when the U.S. entered the war, he tried to join up. He wanted to fight for his country, and it took a while before he was accepted. And finally, he was allowed to fly in the Pacific with a group of pilots, one of whose daughter is here tonight. I don't know where you are, but you're here. Beverly. And he helped to save them gasoline by helping them to work with their engines so that they weren't using up as much gas, so they could travel farther and they could get home more safely and efficiently after dropping their bombs. He was very much healed and energized and loved that work in the war. He loved working with the younger pilots and helping them to understand and manage their aircraft. And it helped him also to serve his country, which he very much wished to do. It meant a tremendous amount to him to do that. So she finished this book just after the Second World War. And the last thing she wrote in it, if I can find it, this book, which went up to 1944. She said she was writing about the difference between her time during the war, which was, as was for so many women, very much running the family and the household at home on her own, and her husband gone, and fighting his own war, and as the women were carrying their own war burdens and responsibilities at home. And then he's home, and she says, "We are not separated from each other by our differing experiences, but rather in some strange way closer. Is this just a miracle of understanding or simply love, or do we really, both of us now, stand at the same point, at the end of something, at the beginning of something? Both of us are groping and a little lost, but we are together." And that was the end of War Within and Without. Then she went on to write Gift from the Sea, to write a novel called Dearly Beloved, about a wedding based on my brother's wedding, but fictionalized, and a lovely book called Earthshine, about her experience in watching from an environment of wildlife in Florida, watching the astronauts take off. They were invited, my parents were invited to watch that. I think it was Apollo 8 they were invited to watch. And she wrote movingly about the combination of wildlife and incredible, tremendous technological advances. And that was kind of the theme for my parents toward the end of their lives, the last 30, 40 years of their lives, was how do you balance the technology that they had helped to advance and pioneer with the wildlife and the environment and all that we cherish on the planet. Then she didn't write any more diaries. She didn't publish any more diaries. But she wrote, and her letters were collected at Yale, as were my father's. At the Sterling Archives in Yale, there's a large collection of diaries and letters, which is now actually open. And many, many, many boxes and boxes and boxes. I know because I've been through most of them, of their material. After her death in 2001, a few years later, my brother and I and a niece and a good friend who's a great project manager and a writer-editor as well, felt there was something missing in the canon of my mother's work. We thought that it would be wonderful if there were one more diary covering the last 40 years of her life, 4 decades of her life. And we went looking at Yale, and we found probably 1,000, 2,000 pages of her writings, and began to pull them together. We went to her editor, Alty Carper, at Pantheon Books, who had published Gift from the Sea, because we thought she would be perfect for this book. And she was very interested and told us to go ahead, go to work, gather what you can. And when we gathered it, we had about 1,000 pages. And she said, this is really great, but it needs to be about 300. and so we cut and we pared down, and we fought over what each of us thought was really important. And my brother said, well, what about all that stuff she talks about me doing in kindergarten? We need to keep all that. But what I found extraordinary and very interesting was a sense of growth, a sense of her changing and her getting to know herself and her marriage, and interspersed with that, her letters to her children at different times. And that I found most interesting, because my father was not an entirely easy person to live with. He was wonderful, but he was, half the time he was just gone, just whoosh, off, wandering the world, here, there, and everywhere. And I know some of the places where he was, but you just never knew when he'd leave, how long he'd be gone, when he'd come back. And my mother kind of took that and worked with it, and completely ran the household when he wasn't there, and then would kind of quietly cede the territory to her husband when he came home. So we were so happy when he came home. It was so much fun. It was so exciting. He would kind of throw us up in the air, and he would take us off to look at wildlife, and in our Connecticut, whatever there was there, but looking at ducks and going to look for deer, and staying up late if there was a flood or a hurricane. He was very much involved with the natural world. And then he'd be gone. And by the time he left, we were just as glad he'd left. And then we all had time to recuperate, and my mother could see her New York friends and drink sherry and do all the things that she didn't really do when he came home, because he was one of those completely encompassing, compelling people that you couldn't do anything else except whatever it was that he was doing. So I would love to read a little bit. That's what I like to do. And then talk a little bit as I go. But I'm finding that for me, it's easiest to read her words, and maybe a few of mine. I did the introduction. And I thought it would give you perspective. I loved doing this project. I loved spending time with her again, with him again, and within the family context. So to follow what I have just begun to say, I said, I am convinced that no woman could have lived with my father full-time, 24 hours a day over a long period. And he lived his life in a way that no woman ever really did, except for my mother, and then only during their early years together. I was certainly amazed to learn a few years after my mother's death that my father had had several relationships with other women during his travels in the 1950s and 1960s, and that there were children from these relationships. However, it did not surprise me at all to learn from these children, when I met them, that the paternal pattern was the same for them. Our lives were all marked by our father's perpetual comings and goings, by a brief intensity of presence followed by long absences over and over again. I met these half-siblings in Europe the summer after I first learned about them. And there were 3 families, 3 women who were close friends, 2 of them sisters, in Germany just after the war, very much devastated by the war. They had been, one family was a family of chocolate makers in, I think, Moravia. and had escaped the Nazis and escaped the war, but not without privations and difficulties. One of them, who was not one of the sisters, was a translator, and her name was Eva von Arnhem. There's a beautiful book by a relative of hers that my mother loved. I want to say Enchanted April, but I'm not sure that's the right title. But these were women who had been very much intellectuals, quite a bit like my mother's family, and had been devastated by war and poverty, falling away from their original lives. I've become very close to one or two of the children of these women, and I can't explain or understand how my father lived his life in this way, but he was associated with some wonderful people, and I love all my siblings, every one of them. And half siblings. So I write that no one could live with him, that there was this brief intensity of presence followed by long absences, and yet I have an unmistakable sense of the strong and independent partnership my parents shared, however strained their connection at certain periods. They knew each other well, they helped each other immeasurably during the almost 45 years they spent as husband and wife, first flying together, then writing together while raising their family. They worked together on each one on the other's manuscript, never changing a word, always making comments in pencil on the side. They would sit together. I saw them do it. And my mother, I think, helped him find his voice. And he would correct her if she, for instance, he'd say, you know what you're saying about these clouds here? Right here, where you talk about the clouds. Now, in an atmospheric condition like this, the clouds could not look that way. They would, so he would correct her. And they continued to travel after the children grew up. They had three quite little houses, one in Darien, Connecticut, on Long Island Sound, and one in Switzerland, a little chalet now owned by a lovely young Swiss man we like a lot, and one in Maui in Hawaii, which was where my father died in 1974. And they would go from house to house. And my mother would say, well, I never remember where I left the tarragon, because in one house or the other. But I think they liked that. I think they when they were together, I think they really enjoyed it. So I'm going to say, I thought the record keeping, for a long time, I thought it was odd that they had not only copies, but not photocopies, but they had carbon copies, 1, 2, 3, 4 of every letter they wrote. One went off to the person for whom the letter was intended. One went to my mother saved for her records, and 1 or 2 went to the Yale archives. So, and I would be very annoyed. I thought, this letter is for me alone. It's not for the Yale archives. But there they were. So they had, in one folder, along with the carbon copies, duplicates and triplicates of letters to friends and relatives. My brother and I found several charming postcards, one written to each of her children, John, Land, Ann, Scott, and Reeve. These were real postcards, decorated with Beatrix Potter-like scenes of little animals with affectionate messages in my mother's handwriting for each child at summer camp. But they were so clean. Had they never been sent? Or had she retrieved them from us somehow at the end of the summer, none of them the least bit grubby, each one pristine enough for the Yale archives? How could that have happened? And why? They're copies, my brother Land said suddenly. I stopped, thought about it, and agreed with him. We looked at each other, trying to imagine our mother first writing 5 postcards, 1 to each child, then copying each message word by word on 5 other postcards. Were they identical? Did they have the same Beatrix Potter scenes? Postcards for the archives. I still don't know how to think about it. But they did that. They saved every little thing. And when Scott Berg, my father's biographer, he wrote a wonderful biography of my father that won the Pulitzer Prize many, many years after my father's death. He said it drove him absolutely crazy. He said there were excuse notes, there were brochures for summer camps, there were recipes, and he was going through all of this stuff trying to write his biography. But they did save everything. And yet I think there were things that my mother, in any case, just didn't write down, and surely he too. So she left us a bountiful record of conscious and compassionate thought brought to life in words, not only in her published books of autobiographical fiction, essays, and poetry, but equally important in the diaries and letters. They shed some light on the conditions that caused her to write her books, and they follow the path of her life before and after, from midlife through the beginning of old age. Her journey, though very personal, became a universal one, and in speaking for herself, she spoke for us all. I think that's why we liked it. We liked her writing. I think she's very close to herself and very close to the reader, and it feels intimate and it feels true. I want to find a place where one of my favorite places is what she writes about marriage 20 years after she married in 1929. And she decided 20 years later that she needed to write marriage vows as she would deliver them at that time. She said, marriage, we are told, is a relationship in the process of change. Certainly, I would express myself very differently today than I did 20 years ago. How? Cry my husband and my 5 children, challenging me. I start to write. Marriage vows annotated after 20 years. I, a most imperfect person, take you, also imperfect, to be my husband in that most imperfect but also most challenging and rewarding of all relationships, marriage. Since I know you are not perfect, I do not worship you. I love that, because I think when she first met him, she did worship him. And it must have been nice for him, but maybe not so good. I have learned that worship of another human being is only a form of shirking one's responsibility, a shifting of the burden to another's shoulders. I cannot accomplish this difficult task, but you, O superior being, can do all. Worship, I believe, is a burden too great for the human frame to bear, and in the end is degrading both to the worshiper and the worshipped. On this earth, one is permitted only to worship God. I do not promise to obey you. Not that I do not long with all of a woman's traditional desire to submit, to serve you hand and foot, but I know that this very natural desire to find myself a master is actually a selfish one and will not really serve you. I would not debase you by assuming that you want a slave. I do not promise to love you. Of course, I do love you, deeply, sincerely, humbly, but to promise to feel exactly this way always would be like promising never to grow a gray hair. I have many already. It would be like the rose promising never to put forth a new bud. I cannot make a promise against time, against growth, against life. It would be perjury. These are my marriage vows, and I will not lie to you. I do not look on marriage as a solution to any of my problems. On the contrary, I know that marriage will be a mirror for them, and that my imperfections will show up with merciless clarity under that naked light. I consider the sharing and working at problems together to be the challenge, perhaps even one of the deepest functions of marriage. On the other hand, I don't promise to live up to any idealized image you may have of me. Please do not put me on a pedestal. Being adored is very close to being despised. It is the reverse side of the same coin, and one is apt to follow the other. This I love because it's so much like her, and it shows a great understanding of him. I do not expect marriage to fill my essential loneliness, nor do I hope to fill yours, having learned that everyone is, in the last analysis, alone, and believing this is not something to grieve about, but to rejoice in. I promise to respect and protect your aloneness, knowing that everything created must have its period of darkness, child and bulb, poem and personality. I promise not to pry into your loneliness. never to tear at the bud with frightened fingers to make sure there is a flower inside. I believe in the flower. I promise to respect you, to honor you as one of God's representatives on earth. I honor the spark of the divine in you. I will believe in this spark, even when I can't see it, even when it's obscured. In sickness and health, in poverty and in riches, I believe in it, now and until and after death do us part. And that was, I loved finding that. I thought, sometimes I worried about my mother, with all of us children, and my father whirling about, and the work she was trying to do, and there was always something. I knew what she had been through. I knew how desperate it is to have lost a child. I myself had lost a child. And I would worry about her. And I knew she was okay. I read that, and I thought, she was always all right. She goes on, she writes a lot about, beautifully, she writes about not writing. She writes about never having the time to write, and why isn't she writing, what's the matter with her, and how come she did on and on and on, and all the time she's writing all this beautiful, all this stuff, letters and diaries and all this wonderful stuff. So she goes on, she writes to lots of people who seek her out in times of trouble. And she writes to her mother, she writes to her sisters. When she writes in her own diaries, she writes quite a bit about the time of life when we lose our parents, her parents and people she has loved, and the difficulty of that, and what is left, what they have given us that we can take forward. She writes to her children. My brother Land, who was away at camp, he spent the summer working on a ranch in British Columbia, and she wrote him because he wasn't sure he was tough enough and to handle it, and she gave him a great deal of encouragement. She said, I think back to the stories your father has told of his first work on a farm, taking over a new job and not even able to manage it, but he did. And your brother John on that rolling tub in the Atlantic trip. John was in the Navy. I suppose it's a kind of man's coming of age, and one feels one should be able to take it if the others do. Why, one thinks, is one so much tired than the others? Because it's new and you're not yet used to it. In 2 or 3 weeks it won't seem so hard. So she's doing this for us all the time, even as she's trying to write and working with her own life and her grieving, which went on for many, many years, about the loss of her baby and the horror and the nightmare that was the kidnapping. She did some years of analysis, learned, she said, tremendously from that process, and went forward, and she spent quite a bit of a very, very happy time in Switzerland writing, and very often with my father coming and going. And then something would happen. For instance, they would suddenly, in the midst of their own lives and with the children and with my father back and forth and my mother writing and going into New York and doing this and that and thinking she wasn't writing, they would get an invitation from the president to come to dinner. It was for a dinner. President Kennedy invited them to a dinner where André Malraux of France was being honored, and Mrs. Kennedy apparently wanted my mother to be there, and President Kennedy wanted to meet my father. And I remember that my father had not worn black tie for something like 25 years and really didn't want to do that. But he did. He did. For President Kennedy, he did. And I think that was, after all those years, all the travel and the dressing up and the medals and the honors and when he was 25 years old after the flight to Paris, he just didn't want to do that anymore. He was a farm kid. You know, he wasn't used to dressing up and being at embassies and all of those things. And he and my mother had decided they wouldn't live that way unless they couldn't couldn't avoid it, but they did go to see the Kennedys. And they loved them. What they loved about them, above all, aside from meeting the people they met and speaking in French, which my mother actually loved, what they loved were the Kennedys with their children. They spent the night at the White House, they woke up in the morning, and they were invited to come and visit with the children. I think my mother loved that. My mother wrote to Mrs. Kennedy, and she said, "My husband and I both enjoyed the personal glimpse of you and the President and your children. We were very touched that you should have found time for this in the midst of the many pressures that surround you. Aside from our pleasure, it is heartening to find in the first family of America the personal touch, the simple directness, and the sense of clear integrity that one feels to be particularly an American heritage." Ooh, that almost makes me cry. So we go on, people get married and have babies, and my mother goes on and writes about all of that. But she also writes to friends, people who have friends who have been in the kinds of troubles we all go through, the losses, the medical situations, the children in trouble, and she continues to write about her travels with my father later. They go to Africa and become extremely, extremely impressed with and desperate about the African wildlife disappearing. And they spent some years working with the game parks and trying to help with that conservation situation. I think my father above all, loved flying over Africa with the game wardens in the 1960s. And he also had some difficulties with his children who were against the Vietnam War. My brother Scott left the country. He ended up in France, and because he did not wish to become part of the U.S. Army effort of our Vietnam War. And in fact, he never did come back. My brother Scott lived in France for many years and now lives in Brazil. He did not have trouble ultimately with the government. He was drafted. He was what do you call it? What was that? They would call us up, and but then he didn't have to serve. But because of the Vietnam War, he left the country. I mean, pretty much forever. His kids are now back here, but he still lives in Brazil. And my father was absolutely furious. He couldn't believe that even if you didn't believe in the war, you wouldn't fight when the time came. It took many, many years before they would write each other long philosophical letters and stating their positions, but they did not meet again until my father was dying in 1974 in Hawaii. And my mother called Scott and said, "You have to come." And he came. And they sat there. My father was by then in the hospital bed, and they talked. And that was an extraordinary, wonderful thing for all the family. But he was not one he was hard to bend when he really truly believed something, and so was my brother. And there they were, but they were together at the end of his life. And I have quite a charming piece about my mother writing to my father writing to my sister, about my father. When my sister was getting married in Europe, in France, she married a Frenchman, and my father, she wanted my father to come to the wedding. And my mother told her, "Well, if you want him to come to the wedding, I'll tell you how to speak about it. You have to tell him it's not going to be a fancy wedding, that he doesn't have to give you away, that he won't have to wear a suit." And she went on and on with the list of things that my sister should talk to him, write him a letter and tell him exactly what the wedding will be and urge him to be there for part of the time. I showed him all the part of your letter about the wedding date. I've already told him I don't think there really will be any wedding in our sense of the word. Tell him he doesn't have to give you away as fathers do in U.S. weddings. No minister, no church, no aisle, no white wedding dress and veil. Just going to the mayor's office. Is that formal? How many people? Actually, it was charming. It was in a little mairie in a town in southern France, in Duziac. And my father absolutely loved it. He had a wonderful time. But my mother was preparing my sister to do what my mother had done all her life, which was to gentle my father into some of these more intimate kinds of occasions. My sister laid the way, and when I had a wedding, he came. But that was very much the way that my mother and father were together. She understood him very well. She could work with him. She could work with us so that we could understand him. And they were desperately important to each other, no matter where either one of them was, geographically, emotionally, philosophically. And that was one of the most remarkable things that I saw in my family, my parents. There's I won't read that to you, I think I'm getting carried away, but there is a lovely piece she wrote called Musical Chairs when she was 75, and she talked about the way her life changed, and quite a bit, in the way that the game of musical chairs is played. You know, the music goes and then it stops and you're on a different stage. And she reviews her life, throughout her life, her time with my father and her life with us. And she talks about what she wants to do at this stage, toward the end of life. And she's decided there are things that you have to do. There's inevitably some tidying up and finishing off the loose ends of life, your life or work. And she's decided that what she wants to do is to stop wasting things. She made a list of her own wasteful activities. And her first item is getting tired. I feel being tired is a terrible waste. I was brought up not to accept being tired. At Miss Chapin's school, we sang a hymn that started out, "Awake my soul, stretch every nerve, and press with vigor on." That was fine for the 8th grade. Not for my age. You'd be exhausted by noon. Besides, getting tired, I find, leads to more waste, like reading the back pages of the newspaper or flipping through mail order catalogs to fill the hour before supper. Perfectionism is another waste on my list. It's all right to be perfectionist in your special area, what you care most about, your skill, your art, your scholarship, even an important letter. But perfectionism in housework is a waste. I don't try to scrub all the black off the pots and pans, and I don't see dust anymore. Clutter is a waste on my list. A good example is what comes in the mail: letters, requests, advertisements, appeals. My husband had a rule: deal with each piece of mail only once. Excellent if you can make an immediate decision. Since he threw 80% of his mail unopened into a large barrel, that worked for him. And I have a daughter who took after him. That was my sister. She has 2 cartons, one labeled love and the other one money. She finds almost everything fits into one category. But I have a great deal of mail that's neither love nor money. When I don't know where to file it, I put it into an envelope marked conscience. Clutter is impossible. It blocks out vision. Down at the very end of my list is a big waste that underlies many of the others, a hidden leak in the bottom of the barrel, and that is trying to live by other people's standards. I remember an old aunt saying to me of cocktail parties, I think, "I no longer put things in my stomach to please other people." Should one put things in one's mind to please other people? read books to please other people, go to parties to please other people. By the time one reaches a certain age, one should be able, as Marianne Moore has said, to have the courage of one's peculiarities. And she goes on a bit. She talks about loving to be outside with the stars, remembering them from her flying years. And I still remember my mother looking at the stars, and she would look up and she could find the navigator's circle from which they flew, and she would repeat their names like an incantation: Capella, Castor, Pollux, Procyon, Sirius. They would navigate by the stars all over the world. She talks about listening, she talks about losses, and she talks about how close one feels to the people one has lost. Not that one has brought them back to one's side, but one feels no longer separate, or separate from them, or from anything of importance. And she quotes from T.S. Eliot at the very end: "The moments of happiness, not the sense of well-being, fruition, fulfillment, security, or affection, or even a very good dinner." I love Eliot. "But the sudden illumination, we had the experience, we missed the meaning. An approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness." She loved Eliot. Then at the very end of the book, she wrote a letter to me after I lost my first son, little boy who died at 2, same age as her son, and he died at her house. He had a condition. He was a meningeal condition that came through a virus, I think. And she wrote to me a year later. It was a terrible time, but she was with me, and she knew when we found her grandson, my son, the baby, had died in his sleep. And she was the bravest. I can't imagine how brave that was, to have that happen in a sense twice. But she kept me going. And she wrote, a year later, she wrote me, this is the last letter in the book. She wrote, "Darling Reeve, I'll be thinking about you this long and difficult week. I will not try and call you, but I am here if you want to call me. I'm enclosing excerpts from the Sacred Pipe, Black Elk's account of the 7 rites of the Oglala Sioux, recorded by John Eapes Brown." She loved that literature and would send us bits when she discovered it toward the end of her life, the Black Elk writings. She said, "I know we fret that anniversaries mark distance, that time is bearing those we love and have lost further away, but perhaps we have too linear a sense of time. Time is perhaps, as the old Mexicans felt, not a river running away, but an ocean around us in which we are steeped. Time," for the Navajo craftswoman too, "surrounds her, as do her dwelling place, her family, her clan, her tribe, her habitat, her dances, her rituals, and my love is around you." And that is the way I think of my mother. Thank you. If any questions at all, yes.
You made it very clear how your mother costed your father. And you said that he was there for her too. Maybe I missed that because I was a little late, but I know, really, I mean,
Right.
your mother sounded wonderful, and I would like to hear how he was there for her.
How she was asking, it was clear that my mother, in your words, cosseted, sort of took care of her husband, and she wondered, how did my father take care of her? It was a different, a very different way. I think, for one thing, he brought her into a world of adventure and technology that she absolutely loved as a young woman. For another, he was the rock for her during that whole period of the kidnapping and after. He was so strong. Also, he kind of kept everything going. He was the householder. He had every little thing about the furnace and the maintenance. And I mean, even if he were away for 6 months, she could still have run that house because he taught her and he wrote it all down, and she felt supported in that way. He did not go into interior kinds of support. She got that, I think, from friends, from her sisters, but that he was a man who did not explore inwardly, and yet he spoke wonderfully about his experience, philosophy, a sense of the natural world, and that was very nourishing for her. And he protected her for her writing. He kind of protected her from us. I mean, he built her a cabin where she could write on her own, and he kept us away from it. He said, "You do not go there when she's working." And by golly, we didn't. We absolutely, when he said not to do something, we didn't do it. But I think his support for her, I think she felt that he supported her. And there were areas where she wished he had been home more. And at the end of her life, she wrote, "Well, now he isn't. He's home most of the time, and I don't get to do anything." So that was a complication. That was but that didn't last very long because he was home because he was ill. So I do think that he supported her, but I think it was a very different thing. And being a woman myself, I'm probably too much on her side. I'm probably not giving, in this book, you will, if you read it in her words and don't listen to my voice, I think you'll see in what ways he supported her. But when I read this book, I love thinking about who she was for me and how I interpreted. So when you read it, you may see it differently. Anybody else? Yes, in the back.
Did she encourage you all to write your own diaries?
My father encouraged us. She asked, did my mother encourage us to write diaries? It was my father who encouraged us to write diaries. He bought them and gave them to us, especially my sister and I. He said, "This is very important. You should do it." And my mother would say, for instance, if you said something that she loved, something lovely about the trees or the beauty of the day or something, she would say, "You should write that down. Write that down." So you had that, well, again, it's the same thing. She would give us the kind of emotional encouragement, and he would get the diaries. And they would be beautiful, beautiful, leather-bound with very light, almost like airmail paper, and a fountain pen. He said, "You have to, this is a very good fountain pen," and he would show you how to work it so that you didn't splotch all the pages. So yes, we were encouraged, and he was very strong in that area. Yes?
I'm not sure if my memory is correct on this, but I believe they were in Africa. And he was deciding when they should take off early in the morning.
Early on, okay.
And so they got up and were ready to go, and then I guess the land wasn't long enough, and he felt they had to get rid of some weight. So over again, he offloaded weight until finally he said, "Okay,
now we can take off."
Now we can take off, and they actually did.
Well, that makes sense. I don't know that story, but that makes sense, although I'm surprised he wouldn't have figured it out beforehand.
My question has to do with whether or not your mother was fearless or anxious.
My mother would have said she was absolutely not fearless. She was scared a lot.
That's what I want.
She was scared a lot, but she also, the book to read is the one John Fox gave me, which is now at the bottom of the pile, but I treasure it, North to the Orient, because that's where she talks about how she feels and how she, at that time, how she really sort of handed over her fear to him, because he wasn't afraid. For him, it was not a. But she said yes, she was afraid, absolutely, but not so afraid that she didn't want to go. She always wanted to go. Yeah. Yes.
What little I know about your parents comes from Lynn Olson's
Okay.
93 years. And,
I don't think I read it. Yeah.
about your father's position against.
Sure.
And your mother's being caught between her mother, her family's position.
Yes.
And your father's position.
Yep.
And I noticed you didn't mention her book, The Wave of Tomorrow.
Oh, the wave of the future.
Yeah, The Wave of the Future.
No, that was the book that she wrote. My mother wrote. She's talking about the. I haven't read the Lynn Olson book about the pre-war years when my father was very anti-war and was called a Nazi, and my mother's family was very pro-war. They were very much for President Roosevelt, and she wrote a book called The Wave of the Future, which someone who read it and didn't like it called The Undertow of the Past. And her position was, it was difficult. What she said was that all these horrible movements, the Nazism and the fascism, were scum on the wave of the future. But she was always quoted as though she thought that those movements were the wave of the future, which she did not. But E.B. White wrote about that book.
Yes, he did.
And that was the best thing I think anyone has written about that book. And he said that it was a confusion of loyalties. And I think he was right. I think she was trained.
It was a very critical but very heartfelt.
It was
sympathetic,
a heartfelt, sympathetic, but certainly he didn't agree with her. But he felt she was suffering from a conflict of loyalties, and I think that's very true. She was loyal to her family, and she was loyal to her husband, and she was kind of caught.
My question is, because you were young at the time that.
I wasn't born.
Right.
I wasn't there, thank God.
You were very young at the time. But I'm wondering if she ever talked about it later, reflected on that.
She thought it was. She talked about that time.
That time and that book.
She talked about the book as if it were just not very good. Mm-hmm. And she did talk about that. She talked about it in an interview for CBS, and oh boy, she had a couple of them. But in this one, she said she wasn't. She loved her husband, and she felt strongly at the time that he was being much too attacked, that he was an honorable person. She then said that she didn't think she'd done a very good job. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I think it's pretty hard to sort that all out. I mean, he made speeches which, when I read them, I thought, my God,
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet I never heard him say anything, racist, anti-Semitic, and any of that ever in our household. I have heard people who did, never him. And I wonder whether, my feeling is that he came out of, I'm not going to say that either, that's not fair, but that he didn't have a clue. I don't think he knew when he made a speech that he would be called anti-Semitic. He said, well, I'm not. Yeah, and
he was a pretty smart man.
He was a very smart man, but what he wasn't was sophisticated. And she came from a very sophisticated family. And she told him not to make that speech, which the Des Moines speech about not entering the war. She said, if you make this speech, you will be called anti-Semitic for the rest of your life. And that's when he said, but I'm not. And she said, I know that, but others won't. We're complicated people. There were people, there was a huge population, a part of the population was against the war up until a certain point. And and then there were people like my father in the America First movement who were drawing large crowds, and then it was inevitable. And we went into the war, that was it. And there were people who were very upset with people like my father.
Reeve, how horrified were you when Trump quoted America
took on the title of America First? I thought, don't say that. I thought it was very difficult, but I'm not afraid of it because I don't think I'm alone. I think we have as Americans, we have all that stuff in our background, and we have family members or people in the past who said things we wish they hadn't, wrote things they wish they hadn't. Lived in ways we wish they hadn't. We probably have children and grandchildren who are going to say things about us. I hope not. But But it's a complicated history that we've got, and we see a lot of things bubbling up now that, oh, I wish we didn't have. But I love my father. Most of the time. I always loved my mother, but I know I loved him. Yep.
And somebody who knows and lives all your mother's memoirs. What did you think of The Pilot's Wife?
Oh, what did I think of The Pilot's Wife? I never read it. A friend of mine told me not to. She said, it's going to drive you crazy. So, but I think people who loved it. And I'm not going to go there because I can't answer your question. Isn't that great? Yes, and I think that's what I understood. And I think she did her homework. It looks as though she had, from what I hear, as though she went through the material. So it's very hard for me to read the books that are fictionalized books about my family because I know too much. I think, no, wait. So, but everybody has a right to write what they want to. Yes.
All the publicity surrounding the kidnapping, and something's going to trial and execution of the kidnapper, amplify the importance of the injury suffered by your mother, loss of the baby.
Did all the publicity around the kidnapping and the trial and the eventual execution of Richard Hauptmann intensify the suffering of my prolong my mother's suffering about the baby? Perhaps. I don't know. I know that she was very much against capital punishment. She did not wish there to be any more death from that death. And I'm assuming that it did. I don't know. I think it's pretty tough after losing a child not to have that stay with you. But I think that's quite likely. I think it affected both of them. I know we always lived in very, very well-protected places. Here I go, throwing things around. We I've never in my life had a listed phone number. That's a family habit. I don't do it. Even now, I don't go on I don't have Facebook. I'm pretty public, but I'm not comfortable with a sense of kind of being completely out there, and I'm sure that I got that from my parents. Yes? Has the family been approached for motion picture rights? From time to time. You mean in terms of a life or and people go ahead and do what they do. There have been documentaries, and there have been, what do they call them? Biopics, things like, but more, I'm thinking more of sort of fictionalized accounts. And we don't have to give any permission or do anything about that. The only film that my father approved was the film of this Jimmy Stewart film of The Spirit of St. Louis. And he really liked Jimmy Stewart, and he thought some of the hoopla was kind of silly, but he enjoyed it. He liked Billy Wilder, he liked the whole crew. And he liked the airplane. They made an airplane, and they thought it was, I should stop. They created an airplane that was apparently really worried the people who created it, because it was kind of rickety, and it was very difficult. You had to hold the stick all the time, fly it every minute, and they were on the set trying to figure out what to do with it, and my father came and said he'd really like to fly the airplane. So he took it up. He took up the airplane they had built according to absolutely the specifications, which were in his book. And he flew it, and he was gone for 5 minutes and 10 minutes and 15 minutes and a while. And he came down, and he got out of the airplane, and he said, I'd forgotten what a wonderful little airplane that was. And it's perfect. You've got everything. That's a true story. Yeah, right behind you. Mm-hmm.
Did you guys fly a lot with your parents?
Did we fly a lot? We flew occasionally with my father. My mother didn't really fly after she had all of us. But he would take us up on Saturdays. We went to a little airfield in Danbury, Connecticut, and the older ones got to actually learn to fly. And I couldn't reach the anything. But I was allowed to use the stick. We were in a tandem cockpit, little Aranca, and I could pull the stick back, and we'd go up, pull it forward, down, and he would explain what was going on. And we actually once, my father told me this it only happened. The engine quit when I was flying with my father, and it was an automatic choke that didn't automatic, and we landed in a cow pasture, and I was about 7. He told me, put your head down. I put my head down, and we just kind of bumped along and landed, and I thought, oh. And he said that that only had happened once before when he was flying his father around Minnesota for a political campaign. And they had to take the plane apart to get it out. So, but I was having fun. So.